somewhere right now, a Christian family is sitting down to a dinner of roasted pork. Nobody thinks twice about it. But the book they build their entire faith on calls the pig an abomination. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 7. And for over 1,000 years, people died rather than put pork in their mouths. Entire families were tortured to death because they refused a single bite. So how did we get from martyrdom over a piece of pork to 2 billion Christians eating bacon without a second thought? What Jesus actually said about eating pork is not what you think, and it matters far more than what is on your dinner plate. The answer comes down to a single conversation that Jesus had with a group of religious leaders in Galilee, and one tiny phrase in the Gospel of Mark that scholars are still fighting over right now in the pages of Cambridge University Press, winning major academic awards for new interpretations. But to understand why that conversation shook the world, you need to understand what came before it. To understand what happened that day in Galilee, we need to go way back, about 1,500 years before Jesus was born, to a desert camp at the foot of Mount Sinai. The Israelites had just been freed from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. They were a people without a country, without a constitution, without an identity beyond the shared memory of bondage. And at Sinai, God gave them all three. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, contains 613 commandments: how to worship, how to handle disputes, how to treat the poor and the stranger, how to structure a society from nothing, and yes, in remarkable detail, what to eat and what to avoid. Leviticus chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 14 lay it all out. For land animals, the rule was specific and non-negotiable. An animal was considered clean, meaning permissible to eat, only if it met 2 criteria. It had to have a completely divided hoof, and it had to chew the cud. Both conditions, not one, both. The cow met both tests. The sheep met both tests. The goat, the deer, the antelope, all fine. But the pig? The pig only passed one. Its hoof is divided, sure. Look at a pig's foot and you will see the split. But the pig does not chew the cud. It does not have the multi-chambered stomach of a ruminant. So it was declared unclean, off-limits, forbidden. And the pig was not alone. The camel chewed the cud, but did not have a fully divided hoof. Same problem, reversed. The rock badger, the hare, same story. The waters had their own set of rules. You could eat creatures from rivers, lakes, and seas, but only if they had both fins and scales. Salmon, fine. Tuna, fine. Tilapia, fine. But shrimp, lobster, crab, catfish, eel, octopus, anything without both fins and scales, that was forbidden. The sky had rules too. Eagles, vultures, hawks, owls, most birds of prey were off the list. Bats were listed alongside them, which tells you something about ancient categorization. And then there were the swarming things, creatures that crawled on the ground, lizards, mice, weasels, all unclean. Now, the obvious question: why? Why did the creator of the universe care about what a nomadic desert people had for dinner? This is not a frivolous question. Scholars have wrestled with it for centuries, and there are at least 4 serious theories, each with real evidence behind it. The first theory is practical: health. In the ancient Near East, long before refrigeration, before anyone understood bacteria or parasites, certain foods were genuinely dangerous. Pork in particular harbored a parasite called Trichinella spiralis, the worm that causes trichinosis. Eating undercooked pork in a desert climate without proper food storage was a real risk. Shellfish spoiled rapidly in the heat. Scavenger birds and bottom-feeding fish concentrated toxins from their diets. There is a fascinating historical footnote here. During the Black Death in medieval Europe, Jewish communities experienced significantly lower mortality rates than their Christian neighbors. One reason, historians suggest, is that the kosher dietary and hygiene practices mandated by Levitical law created a barrier against some vectors of disease. The dietary laws may have literally saved lives, but if it was purely about health, the commands could have been simpler. Cook your meat thoroughly. Do not eat spoiled food. The elaborate system of categories, divided hooves and cud-chewing, fins and scales, these go far beyond practical food safety advice. The second theory, and this is the one that has gained the most traction among biblical scholars, is identity. The food laws were about making Israel visibly, tangibly and daily different from every surrounding nation. Think about what this meant in practice. Every single meal became an act of obedience. Every time an Israelite family sat down to eat, they were reminded of who they were and whose they were. The Canaanites ate pork. The Philistines ate pork. The Egyptians ate pork. The Babylonians ate pork. But Israel did not. The dinner table became a boundary line, a daily declaration. We are not like them. We belong to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In a world where small nations were constantly being absorbed into larger empires, losing their language, their customs, their gods, the dietary laws were a survival mechanism for the soul of a people. The third theory comes from the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who wrote about it in her famous book, Purity and Danger. Douglas argued that the categories of clean and unclean were really about order and wholeness. Animals that fit neatly into their proper categories were considered clean. Land animals that walk properly on divided hooves and eat grass like proper herbivores. Fish that swim properly through the water with fins and scales. These were ordered creatures. They belonged. But animals that blurred the boundaries, that seemed to fit one category but behaved like another, those were out of place. The pig has the hoof of a clean animal, but the stomach of an unclean one. It looks right from the outside, but fails the test on the inside. The shrimp lives in the water, but has no fins and no scales. It is a creature between categories. And in a worldview where holiness meant completeness, order, and proper boundaries, crossing categories was a form of chaos. It was unclean in the deepest sense of the word. And then there is the fourth layer, and this one runs underneath all the others. The dietary laws were about holiness itself. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44. I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make yourselves unclean by any creature that moves along the ground. The command to avoid pork was not free-floating. It was embedded inside a command to be holy. To eat like God's people was to live like God's people. The plate was a mirror reflecting your relationship with the divine. Every meal was a prayer. Every dietary choice was an answer to the question, do I belong to God? And generation after generation, century after century, the Israelites absorbed these laws into the rhythm of daily life. When a Jewish mother walked through the marketplace in ancient Jerusalem, every purchase was a small act of faith. She would pass the stalls selling pork, the vendors offering shellfish, and she would walk right past them, not because she was not hungry, not because the food did not look good, but because she belonged to a God who had asked her to eat differently. When her children asked why their neighbors ate things they could not, she would explain, we are set apart, we are holy. We are different because God made us different. And those children grew up and taught the same thing to their children. For 1,000 years, this pattern repeated. The food laws were not written on scrolls alone. They were woven into the fabric of family life. They shaped how mothers cooked, how farmers raised their livestock, how merchants ran their businesses, and how every household in Israel understood its place in the world. By the 2nd century before Christ, the pig had become far more than just a prohibited food. It had become the ultimate symbol of Jewish identity and resistance. When the Greek Seleucid emperor Antiochus IV, who gave himself the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, conquered Jerusalem around 167 BC, he understood exactly how to break the Jewish spirit. He did not just ban Jewish worship. He did not just outlaw circumcision. He desecrated the temple itself by sacrificing a pig on the holy altar. A pig on the altar of the God of Israel. I mean, think about that for a second. And then he ordered every Jewish person in his empire to eat pork publicly as a test of loyalty. The 2nd book of Maccabees tells what happened next. An elderly scribe named Eleazar, 90 years old, was brought forward and ordered to eat swine flesh. He could have faked it. His friends actually begged him to bring his own meat, something permitted, and just pretend he was eating the pork. But Eleazar refused. He said, "At our age it would be unbecoming to make such a pretense." Many young people would think that Eleazar, at 90, had gone over to an alien religion. He chose death instead. Then came a mother and her 7 sons. One by one, the king tortured each son in front of the others. Tongue cut out, hands and feet cut off, scalped, fried alive in a pan, and each one before dying affirmed their faith. The mother watched all 7 of her children murdered, and then she was executed too. This was not a casual dietary preference. This was a conviction worth dying for. The pig was the line in the sand between God's people and everyone else. So by the time Jesus of Nazareth began teaching in the villages and hillsides of Galilee around 30 AD, the dietary laws were not just religious rules you could casually set aside. They were identity. They were history. They were soaked in the blood of martyrs. Every rabbi, every Pharisee, every priest, every ordinary Jewish household understood that what you ate defined who you were. Clean and unclean, holy and profane, sacred and common. The boundaries were firm, the walls were high, and everybody knew exactly where they stood. That is the world Jesus walked into, and what he said next would eventually reshape the eating habits of half the planet. But what actually happened is far more complicated, far more surprising, and far more contested than almost anyone realizes. The scene is recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, and its parallel version in Matthew chapter 15. Here is the setup. Jesus and his disciples are somewhere in the region of Galilee, that fertile stretch of hills and lakeside towns in the north of Israel. The Sea of Galilee shimmered in the distance, fishing boats dotting the water. The landscape was dotted with small villages where ordinary people, fishermen, farmers, tax collectors, lived their ordinary lives. But something extraordinary was happening. A rabbi from the backwater town of Nazareth was drawing crowds that the religious establishment in Jerusalem could no longer ignore. A group of Pharisees and Torah teachers had traveled all the way from the capital to observe him. That detail matters more than you might think. Jerusalem is roughly 100 miles from Galilee, and in the 1st century, that was not a casual day trip. These religious authorities made the journey on foot, probably over several days, because Jesus was becoming a serious concern. His teachings were drawing enormous crowds. His claims were making the establishment nervous. They came to investigate, and they found something to criticize almost immediately. They noticed that some of Jesus' disciples were eating bread with unwashed hands. Now, this is the part where modern readers get confused, because we hear unwashed hands and we think of soap and germs and our mothers telling us to wash up before dinner. But this had nothing to do with hygiene. This was about ritual purity. The Pharisees had developed an elaborate oral tradition, handed down from teacher to student over generations, about how you had to wash your hands in a very specific manner before eating. Pour water over the hands up to the wrist. Some traditions said you had to do it a particular number of times. Some specified a minimum amount of water. This was called the tradition of the elders, and the Pharisees considered it binding. But here is the critical detail. There is not a single verse in the Torah, not in Leviticus, not in Deuteronomy, not anywhere in the written law of Moses, that prescribes ritual hand-washing before eating ordinary food. Not one. And no, I am not exaggerating. The Pharisees' hand-washing rules were an extra layer, a fence they built around the Torah to prevent accidental violation. Their logic was, if you wash your hands before eating, you eliminate the risk of transferring any ritual impurity from your hands to your food and then into your body. It was a precaution, a safeguard, a human addition to the divine law, and this is where the confrontation ignites. The Pharisees challenged Jesus directly. Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders? Why do they eat bread with defiled, unwashed hands? Jesus does not back down. He does not politely disagree. He quotes the prophet Isaiah straight at them. He says, Isaiah prophesied correctly about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain because their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions. That is a devastating accusation. Jesus is telling the most religiously observant people in Israel that their extra rules have actually led them away from God, not closer to Him. Then Jesus calls the whole crowd over, and He makes a statement that would echo through 2,000 years of history. Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. Later, when they are inside a house with just the disciples, they ask Him to explain. And Jesus says, Are you so dull? Do you not see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. And then He drives the point home. What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside, and these are what defile a person. If you are reading this in a modern Bible, the takeaway seems obvious. Jesus is saying, food cannot make you spiritually unclean. What matters is your heart, not your dinner. And for centuries, that is exactly how the majority of Christianity has read this passage. Jesus abolished the dietary laws. End of discussion. Enjoy your pork chops. But hold on, because right here is where this story takes a turn that challenges everything you think you know. And it starts with 7 words that may not even belong in the Bible. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, verse 19, right after Jesus finishes explaining that food goes into the stomach and then out of the body, modern English translations insert a small phrase. In the NIV, it appears in parentheses. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. 7 words. In parentheses. and they have shaped the eating habits of billions of people for 2,000 years. They are the single biggest reason that Christians worldwide believe they are free to eat pork, shellfish, and anything else they want. But a growing number of scholars now argue that this translation is wrong, not slightly off, fundamentally, critically wrong. The original Greek text reads, "katharizon panta tabromata," and the question of what these words actually mean and who is actually speaking them has been a scholarly battleground for decades. But the debate reached a new intensity in 2024 when Dr. Logan Williams of the University of Aberdeen published a groundbreaking paper in New Testament Studies, one of the most respected journals in biblical scholarship. The paper is titled "The Stomach Purifies All Foods," and it won the Paul J. Achtermeyer Award for New Testament Scholarship from the Society of Biblical Literature, which is the largest scholarly organization for biblical studies in the English-speaking world. That is not a fringe argument from an obscure blogger. That is the top of the academic food chain, no pun intended. And here is what Williams argues. The traditional reading treats katharizon panta tabromata as an editorial aside by the author Mark. A parenthetical comment, Mark stepping in as narrator to tell the reader what Jesus' words really meant. Thus, he declared all foods clean. It is Mark explaining the theological significance of Jesus' statement. But Williams argues, with detailed grammatical analysis and extensive evidence from ancient Jewish texts, that this phrase is not an editorial aside at all. It is part of Jesus' own speech. It is the conclusion of his argument. And if that is the case, what Jesus is actually saying is very different from what you have been taught. Under Williams's reading, Jesus is making an anatomical argument. He is saying that the stomach purifies all foods. In other words, when food enters your body, passes through your digestive system, and comes out the other end, the process of digestion itself removes any ritual impurity that might have been on it. And this reasoning makes perfect sense within a very specific first-century Jewish legal context. There was a widely held view in Rabbinic Judaism that excrement was impervious to ritual impurity. Human waste was considered inherently pure. It could not carry contamination. So Jesus is essentially arguing, even if you eat bread with ritually unwashed hands, even if some impurity from your hands transferred to the food, it does not matter. The food goes through your body and comes out as waste, and waste cannot carry impurity. Your body itself acts as a purifier. The food is cleansed by digestion. And this changes the entire conversation, because if Williams is right, Jesus is not abolishing the dietary laws. He is not declaring pork clean. He is not overturning Leviticus. He is making a much more targeted argument against the Pharisees' extra-biblical tradition of mandatory hand-washing. He is saying your hand-washing rules are unnecessary because even if unwashed hands did transfer ritual impurity to bread, the body would remove that impurity during digestion. The issue was never about whether pork was on the menu. Nobody in the story is eating pork. Nobody is even talking about pork. Nobody mentions shellfish or catfish or anything from the forbidden list. The entire argument from start to finish is about whether eating bread with unwashed hands makes you ritually impure. And Williams is not alone in this reading. A growing chorus of New Testament scholars have been moving in this direction. Jewish scholar Daniel Boyarin has pointed out that nothing in Mark or any other gospel suggests Jesus ever ate pork or shellfish, or that he ate with Gentiles. After this very conversation, Jesus goes on to visit the temple. He keeps the Passover. He lives and dies as a Torah-observant Jew. Theologian David Wilber reinforces the point. The literary context of Mark 7 situates this entire discussion within a debate about hand purification before eating. The story does not intend to address whether you should eat pork or shellfish. It addresses a very different question: whether you can defile kosher food by touching it with ritually unwashed hands. But if Jesus did not actually abolish the dietary laws in that exchange in Galilee, then how did Christians end up eating pork? What happened between that conversation and the present day? Because there are other passages in the New Testament that seem to push hard in the direction of total food freedom, and the first one involves a rooftop, a trance, and a sheet full of animals descending from the sky. About 10 to 15 years after the crucifixion, the Apostle Peter is staying in the coastal city of Joppa. He goes up to the flat roof of the house around noon to pray. He gets hungry. While a meal is being prepared downstairs, Peter falls into a trance. He sees the heavens open and something like a great sheet being lowered to the earth by its four corners. Inside the sheet are all kinds of animals, reptiles and birds, clean and unclean creatures mixed together, cows and pigs, eagles and doves, fish with scales and fish without. Everything jumbled into one massive display. Then a voice speaks. "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." Peter's reaction is immediate and visceral. "No way, Lord. I have never eaten anything impure or unclean, not once in my life." And the voice answers, "What God has made clean, do not call common." This happens 3 times, 3 repetitions, 3 refusals, 3 corrections. Now, the reading that has dominated Christianity for centuries says that God was telling Peter the dietary laws were over. The old categories of clean and unclean no longer applied. Pork, shellfish, everything was now permissible. New covenant, new menu. But here is the part that gets overlooked. Peter himself did not interpret the vision that way. While Peter is still completely puzzled about what the vision means, and the text specifically says he was greatly perplexed, 3 men arrive at the door. They have been sent by a Roman centurion named Cornelius, a Gentile, a non-Jewish Roman military officer who wanted to hear about Jesus. Under Jewish tradition, entering the home of a Gentile was considered a source of ritual defilement. Jews and Gentiles did not share meals. They did not visit each other's homes. The social wall between them was massive. But Peter goes to Cornelius. And when he arrives, he explains what the vision meant. And listen carefully to his words. Acts chapter 10, verse 28. He says, "God has shown me that I should not call any person impure or unclean, not any food, any person." Peter understood the animals on the sheet as symbols. The unclean creatures represented the Gentile nations, the people that Jewish custom had placed outside the boundaries of God's family. And God was saying, "I am tearing down that wall. The Gentiles are welcome. They are clean. I am bringing them in." And there is one detail that makes this reading almost impossible to ignore. If Jesus had already declared all foods clean during his ministry, as the traditional reading of Mark 7 claims, then why was Peter still keeping the dietary laws 10 to 15 years later? Why did he respond with shock and horror? Why did he say, "I have never eaten anything unclean"? If Jesus had already settled this question, Peter missed it completely. That timeline only works if Jesus did not actually abolish the food laws during his earthly ministry. If you are finding this as wild as I think you are, hit subscribe. We dig into these kinds of biblical mysteries every single week, and they only get deeper from here. Now, the story does not end with Peter. Because there is another voice in the New Testament that addresses food more directly than anyone else, the Apostle Paul. And what Paul wrote in his letters made everything we've just covered look simple by comparison. Paul of Tarsus was a trained Pharisee who became the most influential missionary in Christian history. He planted churches across the Roman Empire, from Antioch to Corinth to Ephesus to Rome itself. He crossed oceans, survived shipwrecks, endured imprisonment, and wrote letters to those churches that would eventually be canonized as sacred scripture. And in several of those letters, Paul addressed food in ways that seemed to open the door to complete dietary freedom. In his letter to the Romans, chapter 14, Paul writes something striking. "I am convinced, being fully persuaded in the Lord Jesus, that nothing is unclean in itself. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for that person it is unclean." In his first letter to Timothy, chapter 4, Paul warns against people who command others to abstain from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving. For everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving, because it is consecrated by the word of God and prayer. And in Colossians chapter 2, he writes, "Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day." These statements seem like an open and shut case for food freedom, right? Paul appears to be saying the old restrictions are finished, but the context of these letters tells a more complicated story than the verses alone suggest. When Paul wrote Romans 14, he was not composing an abstract theological treatise about pork. He was addressing a very specific, very real, and very messy conflict inside the church in Rome. Picture this. The early Christian community in Rome was a mixture of Jewish believers and Gentile converts. They shared meals together, which in the ancient world was one of the most intimate social acts you could perform. Eating together meant fellowship, trust, and community. But the Roman marketplace created a massive problem. Meat sold in Roman butcher shops often came from animals that had first been sacrificed at pagan temples. The priests would perform the ritual, take their portion, and then sell the rest through the marketplace. For a Gentile believer, this meat was just meat. Who cares what happened to the cow before it ended up on the chopping block? But for a Jewish believer, eating meat that had been offered to a pagan idol was horrifying. It felt like participating in idol worship, which, when you think about it, is a completely understandable reaction. Some believers, probably Jewish Christians, responded by refusing to eat meat entirely. They stuck to vegetables to avoid any risk of contamination. Others, probably Gentile Christians, ate everything without concern, and the two groups were tearing each other apart over it. The vegetable eaters condemned the meat eaters as spiritually reckless. The meat eaters looked down on the vegetable eaters as superstitious and weak. Paul's advice was pastoral. Stop fighting. The person who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not, and the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does. Paul was building unity in a divided community, not issuing a formal ruling on Levitical dietary law. The same kind of contextual nuance applies to Paul's other food-related statements. When he warns Timothy about people who forbid certain foods, he's likely addressing an early form of asceticism, a movement that taught that physical pleasures, including food, were inherently sinful. Paul was pushing back against that extreme, not specifically weighing in on whether Leviticus 11 still applied. And then there is the Council of Jerusalem. Recorded in Acts chapter 15, this was the first major summit of the early church, and the central question was explosive. When Gentiles become followers of Jesus, do they have to follow the Jewish law? Do they need to be circumcised? Do they need to keep the dietary laws? Do they essentially need to become Jewish? Some believers, particularly from the Pharisee faction, said yes, absolutely, the law is the law. But Peter stood up and argued against burdening the Gentiles with the full weight of the Torah, and James, the brother of Jesus, proposed a compromise that the council adopted. Gentile believers would not be required to follow the entire Mosaic law, but they had to observe 4 specific requirements. Abstain from food sacrificed to idols. Abstain from blood. Abstain from the meat of strangled animals. And abstain from sexual immorality. Notice something. 3 of those 4 requirements are about food, and they are not random. They come directly from Leviticus chapters 17 and 18, which outline rules for the Ger Toshav, the resident alien living among Israel. The council did not say, eat whatever you want. They established a specific dietary baseline for Gentile believers, and that baseline was grounded in the Torah. The blood prohibition alone is significant because it shows the council still recognized that some food laws carried forward into the new covenant community. The question was, which ones and for whom? So where does all of this leave us? Because depending on which passage you emphasize, which scholar you trust, and which tradition you belong to, you can arrive at very different conclusions. And that is exactly what has happened across 20 centuries of Christian history. The Eastern Orthodox tradition practices extensive fasting, with nearly half the days of the year designated for some form of dietary restriction. During Great Lent, Orthodox believers abstained from meat, dairy, fish, wine, and oil. These practices are framed as spiritual discipline and ascetic training rather than Levitical obligation, but the effect is similar. The body is trained to obey the soul. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, dating back to the 4th century, maintains kosher-like practices to this day. Walk into a traditional Ethiopian household in Addis Ababa, and you will find that many families do not eat pork, do not mix meat and dairy, and observe fasting schedules that would surprise most Western Christians. They do not consider this unusual. For them, this is simply how the faith has always been practiced. It is not a fringe position. It is the mainstream of one of Christianity's most ancient communities. Seventh-day Adventists around the world avoid pork and shellfish, drawing directly from Leviticus 11. And this is where the story gets medically fascinating. Researchers have studied Adventist communities extensively, particularly the community in Loma Linda, California, which was designated a blue zone, one of the 5 regions on Earth where people live the longest. Adventists in Loma Linda live an average of 7 to 10 years longer than the surrounding American population. Their diet, rich in plants, nuts and whole grains, and largely free of pork and processed meats, is one of the key factors researchers point to. The ancient dietary laws, whatever their original intent, appear to have measurable health benefits that modern science is only beginning to fully document. The Messianic Jewish movement, made up of Jewish people who believe Jesus is the Messiah while maintaining their Jewish identity and practice, broadly keeps the traditional dietary laws. They argue that Jesus came to fulfill the Torah, not to destroy it. A direct quote from Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. For them, eating kosher is not legalism. It is obedience, heritage, and a living connection to the faith of their ancestors. On the other side, the vast majority of Protestant and Catholic Christians teach that the dietary laws were fulfilled in Christ and are no longer binding. They read Mark 7, Acts 10, and Paul's letters as a progressive revelation. God gradually showing his people that the old boundary markers, the external categories of clean and unclean, had served their purpose. They were training wheels, they were scaffolding, and when the building was complete, the scaffolding came down. Both sides make serious arguments grounded in scripture and scholarship, and honestly, both sides are pointing to something real. But here is what gets lost in the debate, and this might be the most important thing you hear today. Regardless of which interpretation you find more convincing, there is something underneath all of this that both camps agree on completely. Something that Jesus made unmistakably, undeniably clear that day in Galilee. The real point was never about food. It was about the human heart. When Jesus listed the things that actually defile a person, he did not name a single food. He named evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, folly. He was making a claim that was genuinely radical for his time. He was saying that spiritual contamination does not work the way you think it does. It does not come from the outside in, it comes from the inside out. You cannot become impure by what touches your hands or what enters your stomach. You become impure by what festers in your heart. Consider what that meant in a culture that was completely organized around the concept of external purity. The Pharisees had built a massive system of religious observance around avoiding contamination, hundreds of rules about what to touch, what to eat, how to wash, how to prepare food, how to handle a dead body, how close you could stand to certain categories of people. And Jesus looked at the entire system and said, "You are missing the point. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence." That is Matthew chapter 23, verse 25. First, clean the inside of the cup, and then the outside will also be clean. And this is where an ancient argument about bread and hand-washing reaches across 2,000 years and grabs you. Because we do the same thing. We just use different rituals. We measure our righteousness by our church attendance, by how loudly we sing on Sunday, by our political positions, by the bumper stickers on our car, by our carefully curated social media posts, by how quickly we can condemn the sins we personally do not struggle with. We build elaborate walls of external purity, clean categories of who is acceptable and who is not, who is righteous and who is fallen, who belongs in the group and who should be kept out, who deserves compassion and who deserves judgment. And all the while, we carry anger, envy, contempt, and quiet cruelty through our days without ever examining them. Think about the last time you sat in church and felt superior to the person 3 rows ahead of you because you knew something about their life they did not want public. Think about the last time you shared a prayer request that was really just gossip with a spiritual veneer. Think about the time you posted something righteous online while harboring a grudge against your brother, your co-worker, your neighbor. That is what Jesus was talking about. That is the inside of the cup. Because examining the heart is harder than following a rule. It is easier to avoid pork than to confront your own greed. It is easier to keep a dietary law than to root out bitterness. It is easier to follow the tradition of the elders than to do the terrifying work of looking honestly at what is actually inside you. Jesus was not having a minor theological quibble about hand-washing customs. He was diagnosing a condition that exists in every human being in every century. The tendency to focus on visible, measurable, controllable external behaviors, while ignoring the internal reality that those behaviors were always supposed to reflect. The Pharisees kept meticulous dietary laws while plotting to destroy a man they perceived as a threat to their authority. Clean hands, murderous hearts. And this brings us full circle to the original question. Did Jesus say you can eat pork? The honest, nuanced answer is this: he almost certainly did not address it directly, not in the way you have been taught. The conversation in Mark 7 was about ritual hand-washing, not about overturning Leviticus 11. The phrase, "Thus he declared all foods clean," is either a later editorial comment by the Gospel writer Mark, interpreting Jesus' words for a Gentile audience, or, as Dr. Logan Williams has argued with award-winning scholarship, it is part of Jesus' own words about the digestive process purifying food from ritual contamination. Either way, Jesus was not standing in Galilee saying pork is back on the menu. But here is the larger truth. Even if Jesus did not directly cancel the dietary laws in that single conversation, the principle he established that day was like a seed dropped into the ground. It was small at first, almost invisible. A rabbi correcting some Pharisees about hand-washing. But it grew, and it kept growing. By shifting the entire framework of purity from external to internal, by declaring that defilement comes from the heart and not the stomach, Jesus planted something that would eventually grow into a reality his original audience could never have imagined. Within a decade, Peter would be standing in a Gentile's living room in the coastal city of Caesarea, preaching the gospel to a Roman soldier and his entire household. Within 2 decades, Paul would be planting churches in cities across the Mediterranean world, where Jews and Gentiles sat at the same table for the first time in history. Within a century, the church would be majority Gentile, a community of former pagans from every corner of the Roman Empire who had no connection to the food laws of Leviticus and no cultural memory of the dietary boundaries that had defined Israel for a millennium. The question of what to eat and what to avoid traveled with the gospel into every new city, every new culture, every new dinner table. And it demanded answers. Peter's vision on the rooftop was about people, yes, but the logic that allowed God to declare the Gentiles clean was the same logic Jesus had introduced in Galilee. If defilement is about the heart, then the old physical markers of who is in and who is out lose their ultimate force. Paul understood this. The Council of Jerusalem understood this. And the majority of Christianity eventually came to understand this too, even if the details of that understanding continue to be debated in the finest academic journals on earth. But none of this means the dietary laws were meaningless. They served a vital purpose for a specific people in a specific time. They shaped Israel's identity through centuries of exile and persecution. They protected health in a world without modern medicine. They set a people apart and constantly reminded them that every aspect of life, even the ordinary act of sitting down to eat, belonged to God. That principle survives even if the specific rules have changed. Every meal is still an opportunity for gratitude. Every bite can still be received with thanksgiving. And maybe that is the real takeaway from this whole journey. The question was never really about pork. It was about where holiness lives. Does it live in the external markers we display for the world to see? Or does it live deeper, in the hidden landscape of the human heart, the place where no Instagram post can reach and no Sunday attendance record can cover? Jesus' answer was as clear 2,000 years ago as it is tonight. It is what comes out of a person that defiles them: your anger, your greed, your contempt for the people you consider beneath you, your secret cruelty, your quiet arrogance. Those are the things that make you unclean, not a piece of bacon, not a shrimp cocktail, not bread eaten with unwashed hands. So the next time you sit down to eat, whether there is pork on your plate or not, ask yourself a harder question. What else did I bring to this table? What thoughts came with me? What bitterness am I still chewing on? What grudges am I refusing to digest? Because according to the man from Galilee, those are the things that actually matter. Those are the things that defile you. And no amount of careful eating, no dietary rule, no religious observance can clean that up. Only an honest look inward can begin that work. 2,000 years after that confrontation with the Pharisees, the debate continues. Scholars at universities in Aberdeen, Jerusalem, and Cambridge are still publishing papers. Theologians in seminaries across 5 continents are still wrestling in footnotes and lecture halls. Different Christian traditions still draw the line in different places. Ethiopian Christians in Addis Ababa abstain from pork while fasting for 200 days of the year. Southern Baptists in Alabama serve pulled pork at the church picnic. Messianic Jews in Jerusalem keep kosher and celebrate Passover. Catholics in Rome eat prosciutto with fresh mozzarella without a second thought. All of them reading the same scriptures, all of them claiming the same Christ, all of them, hopefully, asking the harder question about what is happening inside their own hearts. And maybe that disagreement is not a failure of the faith. Maybe it is the point. Maybe the fact that this question resists easy answers is exactly what Jesus intended. Because easy answers make us comfortable, and comfortable people do not examine their hearts. They examine other people's plates instead. Because the fact that we are still wrestling with these words, still arguing about what Jesus meant, still unable to reduce it to a bumper sticker, means these words still carry weight. They still challenge us. They still refuse to let us settle into comfortable certainty. Whether you eat pork or choose to avoid it, whether you keep kosher or eat everything with thanksgiving, the question Jesus asked that day still hangs in the air, as urgent and uncomfortable now as it was then. What is inside your heart? Not your stomach, not your kitchen, your heart. Because that is where the real work has always been. And that might just be the most shocking truth of all. If this changed the way you understand this passage, hit subscribe. We go deep into the mysteries of the Bible every single week, and the next video is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about one of the most famous stories in Scripture. It is on screen right now. I will see you there.